Welcome to Differentiated Understanding. What do I mean by this? Well, in a world where there is no longer a massive barrier for obtaining information, diverse knowledge and perspectives are no longer rare. What makes an insight or a way of doing things unique is differentiated understanding. Piecing together scattered information, parsing through noise and clouds, and then succinctly coming up with your own understanding of the situation, event, business, or person. That is what is truly valuable. Every episode, we bring in a special guest to talk about their unique take on a critical matter, phenomenon, or business trend. But most importantly, someone who will offer thoughtful thinking. Hello, welcome back to another episode of Differentiated Understanding. Today we'll be speaking to George Chen. George is a partner and co-chair of digital practice at the Asia Group, advising Fortune 500 companies on geopolitical matters and complex regulatory issues. Concurrently, George is also senior fellow of the Center for Civil Society and Governance at the Hong Kong University and a distinguished visiting professor at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University in Beijing. Prior to the Asia Group, George was Meta's first and most senior policy leader for Greater China, Mongolia, and Central Asia for more than 7 years. Earlier in his career, George held various editorial management positions for media organizations, including the SCMP, Reuters, Dow Jones for over a decade. So it's really, really exciting to have him join us here today. And today we'll be talking about big tech, the shift from social media to AI, big tech trust and safety issues, responsible AI and governance, and then looking more deeply at the APAC policy and infrastructure space. Hey, George, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been really excited and waiting for this chat. You know, you are a very busy man. You're constantly traveling. Can barely reach you in Hong Kong. So I really appreciate your time today. Sit down with me and share your insights with my followers and some of our listeners. To start with, you've worn many, many hats: a journalist, tech executive, policy advisor, and now a partner at the Asia Group, where you advise a lot of Fortune 500 companies on, I believe, geopolitical positioning, right? So when you look back, what is the common thread running through your career in tech and policy?
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the invite. It's quite an honor to join a growing cohort of guests for your program. Really happy to have a discussion about tech and policy issues because I think you're right. My first 10 years in media was similar to your background. And the most recent decade, I work very much on the intersection between technology and policy. My biggest takeaway, from my last job at Meta, one of the largest platform operators in the world, is, sometimes we very much focus on technology development, like the breakthrough, while the resources for policy support are actually quite limited, especially in the Asia Pacific region compared with the US. I think for all the big tech in the US, given the politics domestically, they have to do a lot on political and policy part. But for Asia Pacific, the policy work compared with other investments in data center, technology, hiring of engineers, it's still very, very, very understaffed, under-resourced, and sometimes underappreciated. This is why we need to address some concerns about policy issues as we advance in the technological part. Because I always tell my students, tell my friends, tell my partners that the key challenge, even you have ChatGPT 5.0 or 6.0, the key challenge is how to get the government to understand new technologies and also get the users to have more trust in those new technologies. Otherwise, nobody use it, nobody trusts it, those things. And that makes them.
I think that's super helpful. A lot of times when we think about policy or safety issues, we think about it as like a siloed part of the ecosystem, but really, like exactly to your point, we need the developers to understand the concerns of the users. We need the users to understand the safety risks of the products. We need the regulators to understand what it means to implement these like technology throughout our economy, right? So it's actually all interrelated. I think today, to start off with, let's go into big tech. Just given your background with Meta, working with a lot of these big tech companies, you're based in Hong Kong for the listeners, but actually work predominantly for American big tech companies. What is the fundamental feel right now as we see the evolution be from a social media company for AI to an AI focused company, as this is now their forefront of their strategy?
Right. So for the Asia Pacific region, it's big. I always try to explain to my clients and friends when people talk about Asia Pacific, the first wrong perception, or perhaps from Western perspective, is okay, treat Asia Pacific like EU, right? But EU is a single market. They have very much share the language, English. Also, one currency. And then they have the European Parliament, to pass legislations for all EU member countries. Asia Pacific is far diverse, far different, and much bigger. So it's hard to just copy, okay, whatever works in EU, and then let's also do it in APAC, right? Using AI regulations as a clear and classic example, EU is the first, government, to have the world's first AI Act, right? But the so-called the Brussels effect didn't really happen this time in Asia Pacific countries. You didn't see like all the countries, like Singapore or Japan to quickly follow up on EU, to have a similar like a risk-based approach or a penalty-focused approach to AI, right? Instead, if you look at Japan, they are very much, welcoming. Japan declared to be, they want to be the most friendly, open country for AI developments. The first data exception, for AI testing was actually in Japan. And then Singapore followed, and Hong Kong is also not considering, right? So APAC took a very different regulatory approach to AI versus EU. I think that this is something, all the American tech companies have to realize. It's not like okay, America leads technology, and then EU matters because of the special relationship between US and EU. So, as I mentioned, at the beginning, the resources for public policy work are very limited, in APAC. But EU still enjoy a lot of resources, given this English-speaking market, that there's a lot of political connections, and then Asia Pacific, when it comes to policy enforcement, like policy support, it feels like more like a third country, or like overall speaking Asia Pacific as a whole. So there's still a lot of educational process, the learning curve for big tech, origin from the US, to understand what are the challenges, what are the opportunities in the Asia Pacific market. However, I also need to highlight for many big platforms, Asia Pacific is actually not just the largest market by internet users for American tech companies, for almost for all of them, right? In terms of user base. It is also a very important revenue source, the source of revenue for those American companies. So now you see the imbalance, right? You make a lot of money from Asia Pacific, but the support you give to Asia Pacific is quite limited, compared with in the US and EU. So the learning curve is there. American tech companies want to have a more sustainable development and want to have a more constructive relationship, sort of a more constructive partnership with, Asian governments. I think there's still a lot of work to do.
I think that's really helpful to help the listeners understand, because sometimes people also approach me. They're like, "Oh, what's the consensus on APAC?" I'm like, "APAC is gazillion different markets, and it's actually
That's
so
right.
fragmented, right?" And I think people sometimes misunderstand it, kind of similar to like what you said. They think it's like a EU. It's not like actually there's no consistency in currency. There's no consistent language, or no consistency actually even income or anything. So it's quite scattered. In that sense, I actually want to ask you, you mentioned something just now. You said Japan and Korea this time is taking a more proactive actually approach, as the countries themselves are taking more proactive approaches
Right.
to really embracing AI, and actually compared to EU's more wait and see or more protective measures, right? Which is
Conservative.
not
Yeah,
very,
right.
yeah, not what they usually would do. What do you think the trade-offs are actually in that sense? Do you actually think that means we are seeing more innovation or more technological breakthroughs, or even economic diffusion of the technology right now in Japan and Korea?
Yeah. Yeah, let me put it this way. So AI technology, we believe, still in the very early stage, right? Even you talking about, ChatGPT 5.0, but, if you put that in the overall development for AGI, we are still very much at the, end of the early stage of the curve. So for Asia Pacific region, yes, it's diverse, but we can still see some sort of patterns, similarities in terms of, different AI strategies. At the Asia Group, my firm, we did a research paper on the different regulatory approaches to AI governance in the vast Asia Pacific region, right? From Australia to even Mongolia. Long story short, you are right. Some countries in Asia Pacific take a more economic benefit focused approach, right? Take a more innovation focused approach. Countries like Japan, Korea, Singapore, they want to see how AI can help them to drive economic impact, right? It doesn't mean like they don't care about the safety, the security issues, but they want to have certain flexibility, to encourage more startups, to succeed, right? To a certain degree, actually, maybe too many surprise, because China is very well known as one of the strictest, internet market in the world, right? Basically, none of the American, very few, I would say, like very few American tech companies can really succeed in China. The only two exceptions in my mind are like Tesla and Apple, right? But they are more like consumer related. If you touch on content, if you talk about Google and Meta, that's a completely different story. So, but even so, China this time is also taking a more pro-innovation, pro-economy approach to AI development, because this is a very top-down approach, because President Xi saw the success of DeepSeek, and he basically wanted more success stories like DeepSeek. Japan and Korea are in more or less the same category, like pro-innovation, pro-economic recovery. Well, for Japan, I talked with my friends and colleagues in Japan. The sentiment in Japan is like, we've lost like 30 years, like 3 decades in terms of economic recovery. This is like our last chance. And Japan has been quite strong in robotic, those fundamental technology development, right? So that's the sentiment in Japan. Like, we have to grab the AI opportunity. In EU, I have to say, part of the reason why EU is so keen to develop regulations, legislation in recent like 5 to 10 years, in my view, some may argue and disagree. I think the EU does come with a sense of protectionism, right? Because if you look at all the market leaders, you name it, OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, AWS, like all of them, are big tech, from America, right? I remember, there was a chart, to list the top 10, most advanced AI models. There's only one model from EU, actually from France. The rest are from the US and China. So that tells a lot. If you are the EU regulators, look at, from a competition perspective, you will more or less, have a sense of anxiety. And then you will look at all those big techs like, no, we need to do something, like control the pace, in the name of safety and security. I'm not blaming EU regulators for doing it. But in the meantime, we also hear more and more concerns, even from like the state heads, like French President Macron. He's concerned whether tough regulation in EU on AI will harm innovation in EU rather than help, European startups.
I think we can double click on China later. It's going to have its own special segment for sure. China just such a big story. But for some context for a lot of listeners, Meta and Google, the likes of these companies actually do exist in mainland, but they mostly only have their ad services there. So basically they're helping enterprises with their ad sales to the
That's
West.
right.
But like to George's point, they're not really operating at the full capacity that you would see them, elsewhere in the world. Now, I do want to kind of finish up on the APAC kind of narrative and then the APAC focus right now, which is for ASEAN right now. Let's set apart like South Korea and Japan and China. Just the Northeast Asian countries are frankly
More
economically
economy, yeah.
much more, like developed as well as more economically focused, right? For ASEAN right now, especially since I just went to Singapore last week, it's really interesting. Like we basically have the players, like you said, OpenAI, Google, Meta, all of these global APAC headquarters based in Singapore, even the Tencents and the ByteDance of the world, right? However, Singapore is tiny, like just in terms of size and its resources. So what we're seeing is they're extracting essentially all the compute, energy, data centers, connectivity, any of the infrastructure you need to think of, actually to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand even. They're building them out over there. How do we actually understand this right now? Is this a net benefit for these economies, or is it actually really hurting the local economies and in some ways exploiting them and really just only serving the companies based out in Singapore? How do we understand that?
That's right. So let's talk about Southeast Asia. It's complicated. When we're talking about APAC, actually, the most complicated part, I think it's like Southeast Asia. Because when we talk about Korea, Japan, China, even China is a socialist country, but in terms of economic models, there's a lot of elements related to capitalism, right? So those are the advanced economics in the Northeast Asia region. Southeast Asia is very diverse, very different from each other. Singapore is like the exception, right? The most advanced economy in Southeast Asia. But the economic, in terms of population, the user base is pretty small, like 4 million or 5 million population, right? Even smaller than Hong Kong. you're right. A lot of the tech companies, even before AI become a trend, you talk about like Meta, Google, Apple, they all had their headquarters in Singapore. Really become the hub for big tech, over the past 10 decades. Unfortunately, Hong Kong, thank God that we still have big banks like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong. We remain as a financial center. But in the aspect of tech and innovation, you have to give some respect, to Singapore. They did it very well, to attract those tech headquarters. So this also became, you are right, sort of a point of, I don't know how to describe it. Some of the neighboring countries are jealous, certainly jealous of the success in Singapore, right? And then countries like Indonesia or Malaysia also wondering like how to get the benefits from the fact that all the big tech have their headquarters, regional headquarters in Singapore, right? But if they only care about the relationship with Singaporean government, because they have headquarters in Singapore, and then neighboring countries will not get any benefits, right? Malaysia actually found their own ways in the regional AI race, and their offer is data center because of the stable supplies of electricity, relatively much cheaper labor cost and land cost, and overall cost for data center operations, right? So this is why Malaysia got actually a lot of attentions from big tech too, like AWS, Microsoft. They all made huge investments in Malaysia, not on AI R&D maybe yet, but first on data center. In the AI industry, we have a popular saying that AI is like electricity. Sam Altman said that. Basically this is like the new kind of utilities for everyone's life, right? But to develop AI, you also need electricity. You need a lot of investments in infrastructure. This is why Malaysian already stand out, and Philippines too, in a way, as sort of the cheap alternative, to data center investments, in addition to Singapore. Everybody complains about Singapore, in terms of living costs, and even like how difficult to get a work permit in Singapore, these days. Even you have qualified a job, but it doesn't mean like you will get work permit immediately. Actually, in comparison, Hong Kong is doing quite well, to attract talents more easily, these days in the tech and financial space. Back to the AI governance issue, Southeast Asia also took a very different approach in comparison with Korea, Japan. I think Singapore is an exception. Otherwise, if you look at the countries like Indonesia, if you look at countries like Vietnam, they still take a very more security-focused approach, especially Vietnam, given their political system, right? So Meta used to, and I think Meta still having a lot of problems in Vietnam. One of the key issues is about content and moderation, right? There's a lot of human rights and similar struggles. Thailand too. So those countries, I feel like the sort of the older problems from the social media era was not really solved yet, and those problems will be brought into the AGI era. And when the government look at AI, their first question is, okay, so how can I prevent the people, from using AI, to cause any unnecessary trouble, which means like a social instability, right? So that will be the same older problems facing big tech companies, and that tells you a lot. When those countries look at AI, they still come from a very much security-focused mindset.
That's really fascinating because actually, when we were just talking about the infrastructure build out, on my end, I've done some research and writing on, the Johor build out and the overcapacity with data centers right now, and the unfortunate cause that's just like the local infrastructure is not able to actually support the rampant build
AI
out, and it's actually
development,
affecting
yeah.
the livelihood of people, right? But your point is really interesting. I didn't really think about it that way. It's actually from the perspective of these big tech, actually, it's to prevent bad actors using their technology to actually propel even further, like, bad intentional, harmful content, right? And then essentially, like you said, cause social unrest that would really be very troublesome for the local government. So I guess from the policy perspective, from the social media era, but what would be something different? What would be something that, big tech will have to start thinking about that they didn't even have to worry about before?
Right. Well, as I said, a lot of the older problems from social media era will remain in the AI era, such as misinformation, scam, political speech, especially for countries like, Vietnam and Thailand. Content is always when I worked at Meta, those Southeastern countries are always considered as like a high risk countries, when it comes to like content policy risks, right? On the other side, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, much bigger. They are also smart. They also consider AI as opportunity. So they are thinking like, how can I use AI like to train the next generation of talents, right? Digital talents. Those countries also have relatively younger demographic. So there's a lot of smart kids who can get on AI and then to learn. So I think that also poses the opportunity for partnership for those American tech companies. Can we do some training program for the purpose to grow the next generation of AI talents in those countries? I think that those governments will be very much welcome for those initiatives. And this is not just happening in Southeast Asia. You may know somehow, I also have my strange, career experience in Central Asia. I can tell you, even countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan trying to focus on talent developments because they believe if you think about like learning how to code, right? 10 years ago, this is actually quite an expensive experiment. You need to get professional tutors. You need to get long hours to learning one language. When I grew up, I learned I don't know if you know, we started with like a Microsoft the DOS system, and then no one talking about it. So it took like a year to just get a basic sense of those languages, right? But AI, you don't need to learn the code. It's more important for you to understand how to write a proper prompt, right? So those countries, like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan also catch up, trying to be the back office for big tech, to train, to grow the basic, like the junior engineers, right? So hopefully they can get some basic work done in those countries, for cheap labor cost reasons, rather than you need to hire all those engineers in Silicon Valley. And I think, that posed the same sort of opportunities for Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and other ASEAN countries.
That's really interesting. So there's like a reshuffling of talent, and then also like just the talent strategy is actually changing from the social media era or just like the big tech era. I want to kind of look at responsible AI. So we hear the phrase a lot, right? Responsible AI, AI safety. From your experience right now, what does responsible AI actually look like inside of a company, and what changes in org charts, KPIs, or decision making when we're talking about responsible AI? What are the metrics we must track?
That's right. Okay, so you mentioned that I wear a lot of hats. I don't want to speak like a professor, but I do teach a course at the University of Hong Kong and the Tsinghua University. My course is about digital society and governance. One of the lectures is actually about AI governance for corporates. So responsible AI is a term, very popular, not just in the tech industry, but you now hear more and more just in business in general, right? It's, in my view, responsible AI is something like the privacy statement, right? For different companies. When you go to a website now, like the privacy statement already become like the very normal thing, right? When you use a service, you have to get, they have to get the user consent first, and they need to tell you, what kind of data they collect and for what purpose. That's the privacy statement. Every website you will find, a privacy statement. Responsible AI is similar. So the government is doing their job from regulatory perspective, from self-regulatory perspective. The government work with NGOs and associations to have an industry code, right? But for corporates, responsible AI is kind of like the business-led principles. I want to use Microsoft as a perfect example. I think Microsoft is leading the way how business can take a more responsible, sustainable approach to AI, right? Microsoft is responsible AI. They call it the trustworthy AI, but it's just the name change, more or less the same. Microsoft are very much focused on three pillars, and I believe many other AI type companies focus more or less the same. First is security. You have to have a very secure AI system. That's the basis, right? That's also where the user trust comes from. Second is about safety. You talk about online safety, particularly for those more vulnerable groups like children and women, how to address those issues. Again, the same social media problems like harassment, online safety, even suicide prevention exists, if not get worse. The last but not least is privacy. That's easy to understand. So safety, security, privacy. The three pillars are the key foundations for responsible AI or trustworthy AI or other names. Right? When we talk about the process, for big tech or just traditional business like a Starbucks, when they want to implement AI in their business, we have a method, a means, called the privacy by design, right? In the social media era, which means privacy should be the first thing to consider when you develop a product. This is like a rule ABC, like a 101 for any product manager, right? When I worked at the Meta, we always got a reminder, like the engineers, right? It's not like you have a great product idea and you talk to everyone, and finally you think about, okay, I should talk to my privacy lawyer, right? You should do it the other way around. The first one you should talk to is the privacy legal, the privacy team, right? Responsible AI poses the very similar approach. The first thing when you develop an upgrade or a new service, backed by AI, you should think about whether you can tick the three boxes: security, safety, and the privacy for the AI services and product you're going to launch. Microsoft had set a very good example. When they upgrading, developing the Copilot, that's their AI platform, right, for users. So I hope that can give you a very rough sense of what responsible AI is about.
I think what you mentioned just now that stood out to me is that like a lot of these big tech companies like Microsoft themselves, they have very mature legal and safety teams in place, right? So it's much easier for the developers to actually tap into their know-how and their knowledge. And obviously, like you said, an extension of how they used to regulate content as well as, not just content moderation, but also just like product safety. But for startups, I don't know if you work with them at all or not, but like I just the
We
proliferation
have
of
some
AI
startup
tools
clients,
right
yeah.
now, right? It's like it's very crazy right now. Basically, like you also kind of hinted at this where like, developing a new product is so much easier than it was, say, 30 years ago. It's not only that like, the language of coding has made it easier, but now we have agentic coding tools, right? So you can have vibe coding, whatnot. How do we actually understand product safety and like responsible AI when we start talking about new products within these startups? And also my question is on a broader like picture, how do we understand responsible AI in a big market like China where a lot of products are consumer facing AI versus maybe the US where it's a lot more enterprise facing? Can you kind of give some color on that?
Right. So first of all, on startup, yes, we do have some startup clients, and I'm very glad that like the startup clients we work with in the tech sector are very much either backed by some leading figures in the Silicon Valley or by global VCs. So I think that they do have like a stronger internal compliance control, right? And over the years, I think all the big tech, from Meta to Microsoft, to other companies, I think all the classic incidents, the lessons. Remember, when Mark Zuckerberg had to apologize, for the Cambridge Analytica incident, right? It feels like not too far away, but people had short memory. I think that those incidents that did, served as very good lessons, for those I will say like a more U.S. founder backed startups. I think that their goal is clear. If you want to get list on Nasdaq someday, you'd better do things very right from the beginning. There are some naughty boys cases from China. You probably noticed that there are some like AI startups from China. They like grab the content from Disney, Parliament, Sony, right, to make those funny like AI, effects. But in fact, there was like a serious violation of, IP protected content. But those startups like I don't care. I just like to have fun. Like let's see how it goes. And then suddenly, they got like a 1 million to 2 million, and then to 10 million like users, within a week. So, but they're not going to go far away, right? There will be like lawsuits, this and that. So this is not the right approach. I do think startups need to be very clear about the boundaries. It's not like, okay, you are a startup, so you can lower your compliance requirement, to do whatever you want. At the end of the day, you need to be responsible, not just responsible AI for your users, you also need to be responsible for your investors, right? So that's on the startup part. In terms of compliance, I think the startups in general do pay a lot of attention to compliance with different, especially now AI, as we mentioned, right, if you look at the APAC, there's no like a unified approach to AI governance, right? It's not like EU has AI efforts, so the compliance cost is indeed very high on startups. But this is the luxury big tech have, right? As we just discussed the Microsoft as a case study. So Microsoft has pretty decent size of legal team, security team, enforcement team, right? To support those three pillars like safety, security, and privacy. But for a startup company, you can imagine they probably only have like a one legal, one policy manager, like for everything. That is it. That is a challenge, and then this is also why a lot of companies complain about the very tight regulatory environment in EU, because as a startup, you don't want to spend all your money, not even like half of the money as your compliance cost, right? So I always joke with my friends, like if you hire more lawyers than engineers for a technology company, I don't think that's right. So this is a constant challenge, for a startup, how to comply, but in the meantime, also keep innovating.
I think
Okay.
that's really interesting because essentially, like you said, whether it's a startup or enterprise, in many ways, they're facing the same issue. But my issue right now with kind of the AI space is actually there's lack of international standardization, right? So, for example, like globally, wherever you go, you can't really go stab someone. Like the rules around drugs or even other issues like driving and other safety issues may vary,
Echo, yeah.
but there is like a standardized base normalization or what we believe as humans that should not be done, which is essentially don't kill people. Homicide is illegal anywhere you go, right? So now with AI,
That's right.
with regulation, right? Regulation is that like right now we're not seeing kind of countries come together and say this is a standardized belief that we should just not have. Maybe like you mentioned, like child pornography and like, child safety is something very high on the radar. But even, that can be quite subjective from culture to culture. How do we make of that when, we're going to have AI proliferation across the economy and different touch points in our daily lives?
That's a very important, interesting question and point you make. You reminded me, when I teach my students in the classroom, one of the examples I give them is, I travel a lot, right? So different countries, the first question I ask myself, like, which socket do they use for plug, right? And then even like, well, I know UK is no longer part of EU, but even you cross the border sometimes, from country to country, you need to. That's why we always bring a travel adapter, right? So when it comes to AI governance, it's actually the same problem. You're absolutely right in a very spot on. EU has the EU AI Act. If you are a startup, you want to expand into EU, no argument, no negotiation. You have to comply with EU AI Act, plus several other regulations like the Digital Market Act, the Digital Service Act, and then plus GDPR. So to expand into EU is not easy. The compliance cost will be very high. But same thing in APAC. You go to different markets. Indonesia is going to have their own AI regulation versus Singapore versus other markets. Ideally, the UN should take up a bigger role, a more powerful role to sort of have better control or supervision over like how AI should be used, right? Think about the same question about telephone. When telephone was invented, right? Why, Hong Kong's, country code is A52, right? Why China is like A6? Why US is 001? Because someone made the standard. And for telephone code, that was ITU, right? The International Telecommunications Union. So some people say we also need someone like ITU. Maybe the UN has an AI panel, but I don't know like how powerful the UN AI panel is. I mean, not to mention that the US government is not really a big fan of UN these days, right? So I agree, we should have international standards on AI, especially on AI safety, as a key part of AI governance. We should have some principles. So I think this is something, all the countries are looking to. We will very soon have the new AI, the new annual like AI summit, right? In India in February in 2026. I think that India also wants to use the AI summit as an opportunity to discuss those standard issues. And also to a point, I don't know how many really already realize actually U.S. and China are not just competing in the aspect of AI technologies. like facial recognition, deep fake and other issues, but also compete with each other on AI governance. Basically, US and China are competing like who's going to write the rules for AI usage for the next generations, right? So this is also another flashpoint between US and China when it comes to technology innovation, not to mention the two countries will continue to compete in the aspect of AI technologies. Who's going to have more faster models? Whether it's Gemini or DeepSeek in win the battle. So that will be also a story we watch very closely in terms of competition and struggles.
Yeah, I think it's also just because the technology is moving so fast right now. It's really hard for regulators to kind of keep up, even domestically in each country at this point. So yeah, I do agree. I think we need some kind of international standardization. Met with Kuaishou's representative a week ago, and it was very interesting to hear. They're very focused on the text to image and text to video kind of space. And basically, they said in China, to your point, cybersecurity laws are one of the strictest in the world. Actually, in terms of AI content, AIGC is also one of the strictest in the world. She said that actually, if you remove the watermark, that is actually a criminal offense. Or like literally, you will be like,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, it's quite interesting. And I mean, on one hand, you think it's very extreme. On the other hand, I think it's very needed, right? Like to make sure that deep fake or the malpractice or fabricated content does not spread and
Right.
kind of lead to the social unrest you mentioned earlier, or company disturbance, etc., or even human harm. Anyway, on that note, I want to talk about China. You
Hmm.
are interviewed a lot by the media on China US, whether you want to frame it as tensions or competition or, or the race, whatever we want to frame it. There is fundamentally going to be right now two camps essentially, right?
Right.
How do we actually understand the two ecosystems at a high level? Where are the real fault lines? Are they chips, cloud, data, or like you mentioned, regulatory rules? Help us understand the two ecosystems.
Right. So let's talk about China. So US and China don't just compete in technology. US and China also get more and more clashes on AI governance in how the way AI should be regulated, right? US published the AI action plan, under the current Trump administration. The AI action plan published by the Trump administration is actually already a shift from the AI policy approach taken by President Biden, when he was in office. When Biden was in office, it was more like about protection. Biden focused very much on the online safety and this and that. They even set up the U.S. AI Safety Institute. When Trump, took over, things changed, quite differently. Now Trump is taking American first approach, for, like America's version, of, AI innovation, right? Which means like how we can keep American competitive in the aspect of AI technologies. In the meantime, I think the Trump administration also want to export the US governance model on AI to the rest of the world, to many of its allies, especially in Asia. You have like Japan, Taiwan, Korea. While China is also trying to influence, perhaps mostly global South countries and Belt and Road countries to be more aligned with China's AI governance models. So the two countries are not just competing in technology, but also in the way how AI should be governed.
I think on that note, if you're a developing country right now, whether you're in Asia, Africa, Middle East, and you're listening to pitches from both Washington and Beijing, right? Like you said, essentially, they want to capture the rest of the world. What questions should you be asking to avoid being locked into one ecosystem?
Right. I'm always asked, by my friends from global South countries, and they say, which side should I take? And my answer is no, you shouldn't take any side. You should take whatever that fits you to have a sort of combination of the best that you can take, from both the US model and also the China model. In some ways, China was quite innovative to solve some unique challenges caused by like deep fake and this and that. But in the meantime, the people will say, "Oh wow, but you have to sacrifice a lot of, on your privacy, right? Even the internet, you get on the internet in China, you must be a real person. China has the real ID, policy, right? In Hong Kong, the same. You can't just have at running, you don't need to, you have, even for the mobile phone, you need to register your number, with your real ID. But in the US, this is like quite unthinkable, right? But the real ID approach in Hong Kong and China can certainly strengthen a lot of people's, policy concerns, versus in the US, everybody can join the party, basically. That will also waste a lot of time. I think in China, you will see very much led by the traditional BAT and DeepSeek and Huawei to enhance their AI governance through a more company-led plus state supervised model on AI governance.
I think that's really interesting. You just mentioned something that like struck a chord with me because I was just in Singapore and I was reflecting on how I basically hated my experience there 6 years ago, 7 years ago when I was single without kids because it feels very like not control, but everything feels very watched and very sterile. And, like
Right.
your point, everything is very top down. But this time going as a mother of very young children, I loved it. I was like, wow, it's so clean. It's so safe. I rather give them all my data so they can protect me. They know where to track like bad actors. And I think to your point, it's very interesting. Idea or the value of liberty per se may be very different in different cultures and also might change as you go through different phases in your life. So it will be interesting to see how companies or countries choose which ecosystem to join, right? Based on their own belief system or value system. I want to ask you, how are the export controls right now actually affecting companies operating between China and US? Because I
Mm-hmm.
know a lot of your clients probably, are operating between these two large economies. You sit in Hong Kong, and most of your clients, I would assume, are actually like MNCs, and have some kind of use Hong Kong as some kind of a gateway to enter and exit mainland China, right?
That's right. I think that the China model so far, the China model is basically a more the multilateralism, right? So to work with different countries, multi-stakeholders approach. This is also what Premier Li Qiang, when he was in Shanghai, I think in July for the World AI Conference, he also called AI as a public goods. I find that concept was quite interesting. Basically, he said, this is not just like something you and I should exclusive hold, right? This is public goods. This is for, he almost this is like for the fate of the whole mankind in the future. So we need to share the success, share in the growth, versus like the American approach is very clear. This is American first. We need to take the lead. And America is always taking the lead in AI and technology innovation. And again, don't get me wrong. I think both Li Qiang as premier for China and President Trump, have their own very good reasons to manage AI in their own ways. One is to keep raising the American flag high and to make yourself a role model, right? The other is to have a more open model, everybody can come and share. I think so far, the Chinese model perhaps is more appealing to a lot of developing countries, given that it's more like a cost efficiency, and the top-down approach also to boost highly efficient, rather than more like a bottom-up, democratic approach. You need to talk to 10 companies to get alignment, this and that.
Yeah, actually, you just touched on something I was going to ask you. Like, China has pushed out the AI Plus initiative, and they were, like you mentioned, Li Qiang and them are just kind of like embracing this idea of exporting AI to global south. But beyond the branding, I was going to ask you, do you think it's actually successful? But it sounds like they are, right? Like it sounds like the global south is adopting China's AI ecosystem because it's more cost efficient, deployable, scalable, given that's
Right.
open source, open weight, right? I think I want to ask you one last question on this section, which is you comment on China's AI ecosystem a lot in the media. What is something that we're missing here? What are people kind of missing, maybe even in mainstream media, that you think is very important for people to know?
That's an interesting question. I think that the international cooperation part is something, I'm quite concerned about. So China has a lot of, good engineers. Actually, we also saw a lot of engineers, coming back to China from the US. However, both sides, like the US and China, should talk to each other more to maximize, the research capacity, for the overall interest of the whole mankind. So far it's not happening. And then the result is, I also think, AI, the reason why AI is so special is, I believe AI also touches on ideology, the way how people think about things. So the US right now is very US-centric, just focus on their AI. And then China is very much Oriental focused, trying to focus on their version. So when the two AIs basically a developer in the parallel approach, you don't talk to each other, and that will result in a more divided world when it comes to content moderation, when it comes to understanding certain issues, which policy approach you take, to explain a historical event, for example. If the two countries, US and China, they don't talk to each other, it's not going to be helpful, for the overall development in our R&D. So again, when I teach my course about digital governance, I use the world's most popular apps as an example. Can you believe, it may not be a surprise for you, actually, 7 out of 10 most popular apps are in English, originally from the US, very much from California. The other 3 apps are either from China or Singapore. It tells you something. I think when social media companies began to expand into the Asian region, a lot of countries were fearful of the impact that American social media could bring to their markets, right? They are also talking about the so-called digital colonialism, right? Which AI you use, that will influence your thinking. So I think in a way, people also need to be mindful whether you are too much into the US model AI, and then that also began to change the way how you think about things. I actually tested the Chinese AI, and I tried some new features of the AI models. So I'm trying to think about which model I use. But my point is actually the Chinese models are very local, very efficient. For example, when I'm in Beijing, right, I'm not going to use ChatGPT, not because of BVPN, but I just find the DeepSeek, the database they have is more practical and efficient and timely than say Gemini and ChatGPT-4, right? So if I look for the best noodle restaurant, the deep in Beijing, actually, the answer from DeepSeek, could be much better, more accurate, than Gemini and the.
That's really interesting because I think it reminded me of Zhipu, one of the Chinese startups, and they said that they're actually working with local governments in the global south. And exactly to your point is that they localize information, localize the culture or language. It goes beyond just the surface language, right? I think that's really interesting. I wanted to ask you one last question, which is what is one differentiated view or non-consensus view you hold? This could be about the AI sphere, or it could be about something in life.
Like a fear, like I'm afraid of.
But no. Like something you think differently than others. Non-consensus view.
Interesting. Let me think about it. Okay, so I'm still trying to understand how we should position AI. There is a debate in the industry whether we should position AI as your assistant or more as your partner. I don't have a clear answer on that. In some cases, I want the AI just to be my assistant, which means I tell AI to do what, and then you do exactly what I want you to do, right? But I also understand if you just position AI as your assistant, that will also limit the potential, of the development capacity of AI. Right? But when you treat AI more as your partner, I'm thinking about the one of my favorite movies. I don't know if you remember, there was a movie called Her. There was an engineer, talking to the computer. Right? Scarlett Johansson
Scarlett Johansson, yeah.
Yeah, Johan played the sounder part for the AI. So that was quite a romantic movie, but the ending was not very, but it was not a happy ending. So I'm trying to think if you position AI as a partner, you can empower AI to do more things. But there, whether eventually we will also enter some dangerous, territory, to have AI to have. Then we need to talk more ethical issues, right? If you treat the AI more as a partner. There were discussions, yes, AI doesn't have feeling, but should we also ask the AI to work for a nonstop, right? If you think about human rights, a human will work for 10 hours, 12 hours, you should have taken a break. Why we shouldn't just keep asking AI all these questions, keep them running the models to get the result. And even AI doesn't have, the touch feeling. Does AI have emotional intelligence? I believe at some point the AI will have emotional intelligence. That is to say, if you use AI as sort of a slave, they will also be unhappy. So back to my point, I don't have a clear answer, but I'm still wondering which sort of status, a category, we should put the AI into, more as an AI assistant or as a a human counterpart.
I think that conversation can warrant another conversation on its own, that topic, because I think to your point on the technology aspect, we are seeing a shift from AI just to consumer end, just as a chatbot, to agentic AI, right? So to your point, AI can actually start completing tasks for you. They can be more proactive, remind you to do things. They are more like a thought partner versus an assistant. But again, to to even the conversation we had earlier, it's like who can play God? Who is to say where is the line, right? And your 10 to 12-hour work ethic thing is very Chinese and American. Definitely in Europe, people are not working 12 hours a day. That is like that is a normal work day for Americans and Chinese. But again,
That's right. Yeah, you already
yeah.
see the cultural difference here, for even for the real world and for the AI,
Right?
in
So
different
who
parts of
gets
the world.
to set the standards? And I think it will become harder and harder. It's because then it becomes more philosophical and ethical than just, practical, which is right now what we're talking about AI safety is just like, okay, child pornography is fundamentally wrong. Like homicide videos is not allowed. Don't create fake videos of people doing fake things. That is very black and white. We can almost just all universally agree. But when it becomes like cultural, you have to consider culture norms, even language norms, societal norms, etc., right? Or even each person's emotion capacity is even different. Then who gets to decide when AI needs to stop, right? That's definitely like a very interesting topic. And I've been having this conversation with friends as well. It's like, has technology hit a point of actually further development, does not progress society as a whole anymore? Or are we still actually benefiting from technological advancement? So anyway, I really, really appreciate that. And I can go on forever. This is an interesting topic. Thank you so much for your time, George. I really, really appreciate your insights and all the expertise and experience you bring to us. Is there anything else you want to share, or we touch
No,
on everything?
yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting conversation. I also learned a lot, from exploring some questions, together with you, through the past 30 or 40 minutes. And I
It's
hope
been
this
almost
is
an hour.
useful. Oh, almost an hour. Wow, you have to do some good editing.
Thank you so much, George.
If you enjoyed this conversation and found it insightful, please follow and subscribe to Differentiate Understanding on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Grace Zhao, and thank you so much for listening. And I'll be so grateful if you shared an episode with a friend.